Hello, and welcome to our first lecture of this online class. Today we're going to be taking a look at some of the major themes here in Chapter 1, focusing around issues of crime law and criminal justice. And this chapter really does kind of set the stage for this course by providing us with just some basic background about the criminal justice system. I should note that the first lecture here will cover the entirety of Chapter 1, whereas in other chapters you'll notice that we've broken up the lectures into specific themes. But given that this really is a overview chapter to kind of set the stage and give you a bit of a perspective, I thought it would be best to kind of keep this all together. I should also mention that while I won't spend really any time in these lectures talking about the different current controversy essays, you will definitely want to make sure that you don't forget to read those. Not only will that information become important when it comes time to take your quizzes, but it also is a key understanding of both these issues as well as the format when you go to write your pro-con paper for this course. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So when we think about the criminal justice system, we want to make sure that we understand that there are three major components of the criminal justice system, right? So we've got policing, we've got courts, and we've got our correctional system. Now, there is a relationship between each of these components. They both operate independently of each other, as well as at the same time operating in conjunction with each other. Each group does make decisions that impact other groups, and so it's important to think about how those interrelationships can have an effect on each other. So if we think about police, right, what are their major tasks? Well, they are tasked with basically identifying when crime happens and responding to those acts. They are responsible for apprehending offenders. They are really the first contact that most people will have with the criminal justice system. When you kind of relate that to our other components, such as the courts, right? So courts are going to determine whether or not an offender should be charged, should they remain in custody, should they be released. They're going to determine how a case is going to proceed through the system, making sure that somebody's legal rights are upheld. You're going to have interactions between prosecutors and defense counsels, as well as the judge as kind of the impartial individual in this whole process. In some cases, although not in all, you'll also have a jury. Finally, you've got the correctional system, and their job is to carry out the punishment that is imposed upon an offender by the court. Maybe they have a sentence of time to jail or prison, depending on their crime. Maybe they have other sentences that relate to community supervision, fees, or community supervision, those sort of things. So all of these things work within each other. So without the police, we wouldn't have anybody to bring to court. Without the courts, there wouldn't be the need for a correctional system. So while they all operate independently, they're very much reliant on each other. And so each plays a very crucial role within our criminal justice system. One of the key issues in our criminal justice system is the role of discretion and ethics. What do those two terms mean, right? So discretion refers to the freedom of our criminal justice actors to make decisions. So if you think about a police officer, they're using discretion to determine whether or not to make an arrest. A prosecutor is using discretion in determining which charges to file against an offender, right? So it's a very powerful tool. In fact, it's probably the most powerful tool that we have in our criminal justice system, which is this ability to decide what to do with cases or offenders, right? Ethics, on the other hand, refers to the understanding of what constitutes good or bad behavior. And as an actor in the criminal justice system, you are confronted with ethical decisions every single day. And you've got to decide right versus wrong and what you want to do in these. So when we think about the different types of cases that we see in the criminal justice system, one of the ways in which we've used to describe these cases is to talk about them like they're different layers of a wedding cake. So here's a graphic that kind of takes a look at these different layers. You'll see that the bottom of the cake, which is the biggest layer, is made up of misdemeanors, right? Misdemeanors are your least serious type of crime that you'll see in the criminal court. This is what makes up the majority of our cases. Many of these cases don't go to trial, right? They're resolved through plea bargains or those sort of things. And they generally do not have a significant amount of punishment tied to them. So, for example, the maximum punishment for a misdemeanor crime is 1 year in jail. But that really does make up the majority of our cases. If you go to the next layer in our kind of wedding cake, if you will, these lesser felonies. These are crimes that are, lower level. They tend to be nonviolent in nature. Many, again, are also handled by plea agreements, and they don't tend to involve significant incarceration sentences. Now, that compared to the serious felonies, now you're looking at more cases of violence, more serious cases, and ones that probably involve a fair amount of jail or prison time. And obviously you look at the size of that layer compared to the size of the misdemeanors, right? So each layer you're seeing fewer and fewer cases. But at least so far in this cake model, you're seeing those punishments go up. That shifts a little bit when you get to layer 1, which is the celebrated cases, because you'll find 2 different types of cases within this top layer of the cake. You will find your high-profile, very violent, maybe cases where somebody is facing life in prison without the possibility of parole, or maybe even the death penalty. The cases that make those docudramas, if you will, right? The things that you'll see on cable TV, stories about particular offenders, right? The Charles Mansons, the, Sirhan, the really popular cases that people tend to write a lot about. You'll find those in there. At the same time, you'll also find cases that make the media for different reasons, and those are cases involving celebrities. Now, many of these cases are probably things that would be in any of the other layers of the cake, right? So you'd have somebody like a high-profile celebrity star, right? I used to always use the example of Lindsay Lohan, Paris Hilton, Justin Bieber. I mean, I get it. Some of my references are getting a little outdated the older I get. But these are cases of Hollywood celebrities, right, who got in trouble with the law, maybe for drunk driving, disorderly conduct, those sort of things. But they make the news, and they become very newsworthy because of who they are. And so you'll also find them in these celebrated cases as well. Now, these are obviously individuals who don't tend to get those LWOP or those life in prison without the possibility of parole or death penalty, right? Not to say that we don't see, cases where somebody has been a celebrity and then they end up involved in various serious acts, right? The NFL star Aaron Hernandez is a great example of that, right? Somebody who seemed to have it all and then engaged in a very violent crime. So he too would be in that category of celebrated cases. So that top layer of the cake is comprised of a couple of different populations. But at the end of the day, where the criminal justice system spends most of its time and most of its energies on a day-to-day basis is in that bottom cake layer with the misdemeanors. One of the ways to talk about how cases move their way through the system is to look at some of the different models of criminal justice. And we tend to think about models in one of 2 ways, right? We have a crime control model, and we also have a due process model. Now, the crime control model, the best way to describe that is to think of it like an assembly line, right? So basically, you're thinking about that the goal of the criminal justice system is to suppress and control criminal behavior, right? And so that when you have acts of crime, you're trying to process them as orderly and efficiently as possible, right? Something under a crime control model, which is certainly something that the Trump administration is pushing forward, right? This very swift and certain justice for violators, that it's very important that people are punished for their crimes. That's very much a representation of the crime control model. What are some of the concerns with it? Well, there is a concern that sometimes this assembly line process of moving people through the system quickly and efficiently, could that potentially jeopardize their constitutional rights, right, in terms of things like due process? Speaking of due process, that is the category of our other model, right, where the main goal is to make sure that the rights of individuals and our freedoms are in fact protected, right? And so this could best be described as an obstacle course. And so some people really see it as, oh, okay, well, here you have all these rights, and they're like landmines, and the criminal justice system has to move around them and swerve and try and figure their way through, with the end goal being prosecuting an offender, right? So things like search and seizure, some might see that as an obstacle, right? The rules about when you can search somebody, when you can take things from them. Some might see that as an obstacle that gets in the way of processing a case. The due process model really does value a system that is fair and equitable for everybody involved at every stage of the process. And they really do think that it's better for a guilty person to go free than to risk incarcerating the innocent. Now, one of the criticisms of this model is that some say that focusing so much on the rights of the offender can sometimes shift your focus away from crime victims, and that it gives criminals too much freedom and leeway to be able to escape justice. So the last theme that I want to talk about in our first lecture here is looking at the influence of the media, and it has a significant influence on our criminal justice system. I mean, think about it. Maybe the first time that you were exposed to the criminal justice system or its inner workings might have been through a TV show, right? We hear that a lot from students, that they get excited about criminal justice because, oh, they love Law and Order Special Victims Unit, or that they love Chicago PD, right? And so the media does have a significant influence, both in terms of its kind of more Hollywood depictions of criminal justice system, as well as what I was referring to earlier, those docudramas, right? The documentaries that are sensationalizing different aspects of the criminal justice system. I mean, even going back to the old classic of that show Cops, if you haven't seen it, YouTube it, right? But, these sort of things have always had a significant influence on our criminal justice system. So some of the ways in which that comes to be is in something that we call the CSI effect, right? So if you've ever seen those TV shows about CSI, both the Hollywoodized version as well as kind of forensic files, those sort of things. Well, the CSI effect really does refer to that popular crime drama, CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, where you have a case where it's presented in an episode, and oh, by the way, it's solved within those, 45 minutes, right? Once you take out your commercials. And they use really sophisticated tools and analysis of crime that typically are not available or utilized in a standard criminal justice case. Right, but even beyond this particular example, right, stories of crime and criminals have always been kind of a mainstay in our TV programming, right? Reality TV, right, being that other example, right? I was talking about that show Cops, and we have the First 48. We've got a whole bunch of examples of these shows. And they really do present a distorted view of the reality of crime, right? That, it's not always graphic. It's not always violent, right? But even if you turn on your television news, you'll often see that we talk about if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so if you have a high-profile crime story, it'll tend to be within those first couple of stories of your local nightly news, right? And these sort of things can have a significant emphasis on real issues in criminal justice, because when you overemphasize those violent crime incidents, it leads people to think that violent crime is out of control, that it's crazy, and that, we're just in a lawless society, right? And this can have impacts on public policy. It can have impacts on like how it influences fear about people and crime, right? That if people think that crime rates are rising and they don't see that police are doing anything about it, right, that can impact how citizens feel about the police. And maybe they might be less likely to reach out to them in times of, kind of needing help, right? That we also see that people who watch a lot of the local news and are overexposed to these sort of like, if it bleeds, it leads moments, that they tend to have higher punitive beliefs about the punishment of the offenders. I always love to use the example of my Nana, right? So she was 90 years old and she would literally sit all day and watch the news. And so she had this view that crime in her neighborhood was just out of control and that people weren't doing anything to come up with these sort of things, right? So this really does have an impact then on what, our public policy folks do, what our politicians do, both at the local level as well as at the federal level, right? So if you think about that a number of our criminal justice policies, particularly related around sex offenders, have tended to be named after crime victims. We've also seen things like some of our, things with war on drugs, get tough on crime laws, our immigration laws, right? Those have all stemmed from people's fears about the reality, often an inaccurate perception of the reality of crime. So, in conclusion, we want to make sure that we understand throughout this class that we do have tools to combat crimes. We'll be looking at laws. We'll be looking at the role of discretion as it pertains to the different functions of our criminal justice system. And we'll also be looking at the issue of ethics. At the same time, we have tools that can be both helpful and harmful for society, right? Whereby, yes, we can move cases through the system faster, but what cost? What are the implications of that? Sometimes we have competing interests within the same system, right, that make it very difficult for justice to function in a smooth and efficient manner. And at the same time, we also have very diverse needs in society, right? And so our criminal justice system, how do we meet the needs of that diverse society? And that's a really important factor to consider when you're talking about issues of police-community relations, when you're talking about issues of mass incarceration, right? And you're talking about issues of crime prevention. All of those things will mean different things to different communities. And so how do we balance that as a system? Thanks so much, and we'll see you guys later. Bye.